Welcome everyone to the Mass AITC May session of our webinar. I'll sort of give a general overview of today's session. People can sign up for the June webinar. So my name is David Paquette. I'm the Associate Director of Research. And today we are privileged to have a presentation from one of our Grant Year 2 pilot awardees, Erik Page, who is the founder and CEO of Blue Iris Labs. And Erik is, as I mentioned, Blue Iris Labs. So he'll be talking about work from his pilot project that was funded through Mass AITC as part of the A2 Collective. So we're fully privileged. And sort of while we're waiting, feel free. Next month we'll be having two additional presentations from two more pilots from our healthy aging portfolio. Hamed Tabiki, who's the co-founder and CTO of Foresight Cares, will be talking about a digital health computer vision solution for monitoring at home older adults with Parkinson's disease. And then John Ralston, co-founder and CEO of Neurosantis Inc., will be discussing their device that they measured for measuring balance, inner ear balance, and electrical stimulation as an alternative to drug-based therapy for balance. So it's looking at fall risk in multiple avenues and also providing means of correcting that, which is super novel, and we're excited for those two presentations. So please feel free to scan and also drop in to the meeting a link for that registration. I'm going to quickly stop share for a second to provide, and so shifting over gears, we have an introduction from Dr. Rebecca Spencer, who is one of the co-directors of our Clinical Translation Validation Core, who worked extensively and is a sleep expert, and she's going to provide introductory remarks via recording because unfortunately she was not able to be here today.
I'm excited to introduce Erik Page and his talk today on the impact of light exposure on sleep, a pilot study. Before I do that, I want to introduce you to two friends. Here's Lauren. Lauren is 45 years old. She's a research scientist, and she's married with two teenage kids, and she's a lifelong exerciser. And this is Kristen. They work in the same building. She's also a research scientist, same age. She's married with two teenage kids, and she too is a lifelong exerciser. This is a bit of a look at Lauren's weekly schedule. So Lauren wakes up early to go for a run 3 days a week before work. On the weekend, she runs a bit later when she meets up with friends. The days that she doesn't run, she goes to the gym, but she likes to do that in the evening so that she can sleep in a few days of the week. These things, well, she mean that she goes to bed a little bit earlier on the nights that she's going to wake up early the next day. These things also move around what time she's eating. If she's going to go to bed later, she'll have a meal later, and so forth. Now here's Kristen. Kristen also runs 3 mornings a week, but the days that she's not out for a run, she goes to the gym at the same time. So her meal schedules end up pretty regular, and her sleep schedule is as well. She does let herself have a leisurely brunch on a weekend, but other than that, things are pretty consistent. So there's a couple other differences between Lauren and Kristen. So Lauren has a greater risk of heart disease and diabetes, greater risk of anxiety and depression. She has a greater risk of poor sleep and insomnia. She has more cognitive lapses and inattention. And importantly, Lauren has circadian rhythm variability that's greater than Kristen. So all of that differences in the timing of her behaviors is that greater circadian variability or variability in the rhythms of her behavior relative to Kristen. So these differences in circadian rhythms can also be seen in kind of certain populations. So individuals that shift work are forced into highly variable schedules, so they have high circadian variability. Likewise, older adults, partly by life choices, partly by not being able to sleep consistently for various reasons, also have high variability in their circadian rhythms. But like I said, the circadian rhythms are associated with a lot of health outcomes, and that's because a lot of things are under the control of circadian rhythms, particularly at a brain level. So Hormones that determine hunger and feeding are under circadian control. Arousal and attention is under circadian control. Cortisol and energy expenditure and the way we respond to stress is also controlled by circadian rhythms. And even our memories is controlled by our circadian health because the proteins that are involved in forming those memories are under circadian control. So it's really important to think of like, how can we live in an optimal circadian way and have good circadian health? Bringing it into this audience that's really interested in AD, there's also a known relationship between AD pathology and circadian variability. And so those with more AD pathology have been shown to have higher variability in their circadian rhythms. So it's important to think about, if circadian rhythms are so important to our health, how can we measure it? Well, there's some really complicated ways that you can use to measure circadian rhythms, including dim light melatonin onset. So this is looking at when is melatonin excreted relative to when the lights are dimmed. And this is really hard to measure because it requires having people in pure darkness, often multiple different nights, and taking saliva or blood samples in order to get the melatonin quantity. You can also use measures of core body temperature, although it's questionable how accurate that is at assessing the rhythm. And that too is quite difficult to take. Not too many people want to do it that way. So a common alternative is to use actigraphy, and that's because actigraphy allows us to assess patterns of physical activity and sleep. And so the patterns between being awake and being asleep allow us to look at the rhythms of those behaviors. And actigraphy is a good way to measure all of those. But a challenge that even people here have looked at is, how can we accurately measure sleep and wake in individuals, particularly free living individuals? This is just to show you across a few different studies that most of the commercial devices are not very good at measuring sleep or wake. So if we look at how well they do at measuring total sleep time, you see most of these commercial devices have a lot of bias. Likewise for assessing wake, so when you're awake in the middle of the night or when you wake up in the morning, there's also a lot of bias in most of these commercial devices that you see here. And not only is assessing sleep a real challenge that I face and have worked a lot on, but assessing light is really difficult as well. And light is critical to reinforcing our circadian rhythms. And that's part of why we want to keep our schedules as consistently as possible, to keep our light exposure as consistent as possible. And so when we can think about how can we measure light accurately, well, you think like, okay, there's a light meter that looks like this. It's what you might see a photographer use to measure the light before taking a photo. But obviously that's big and clunky and not something that we're going to give to participants. So perhaps more commonly in my field, at least, people have used the light meter that's on these watches, the research-based actigraph watches. You can see the meters there. And that's good in the case that looks like this, where this watch is visible. But most people, when they're sleeping, the watch is going to be covered by a sleeve, and most commonly by a blanket. If they're outside, it's covered by a coat. So it turns out these aren't super useful, even though that's a prevalent measure out in the field. We've even gone so far as to put one of these watches around the neck of a teddy bear and put it on the bedside stand of the kid so that we'd have some light measurement, at least while they're sleeping. That still doesn't solve the problem of like, well, they're wearing a coat or something outside. And also, as Erik will explain, like, where is the light relative to the eyes, where it's most important. So this is why I'm really excited about Erik's work and the devices that he's been looking at, and just the relevance in the field, and because light exposure is really critical to sleep and circadian health. And I look forward to learning more about what he's found in this pilot study.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for having me, and I appreciate that intro from Dr. Spencer. I wish he could have been here, but that was a really nice setup for what we're going to be talking about here. So yeah, I like to be even more dramatic about the importance of circadian rhythms for everything that we're doing, and I like to say that it's really fundamental to life on Earth. That life has evolved on a spinning planet with alternating patterns of light and dark that has been present since the first life started here, and that has basically led all life on Earth to develop circadian rhythms, which are really kind of biological processes that we've evolved to try to have our internal biology uh, get in sync with our external environment in ways that support our life. So it's fundamental to many, many parts of our physiology. And light hitting the retina is the primary mechanism for entraining our circadian rhythms. So it really is a critical element to much of our biology. And kind of important to note, kind of right here on the top, is that as important as it is, today we spend about 90% of our time inside buildings where we're getting about 1% of the light that we get if we are outside during the day. And then at night, we come inside buildings where we turn on lights, where we're getting a lot more light than we ever evolved to get at night. And then we hold up screens to our faces and get even more light. So we're doing pretty different things than we evolved to do around circadian rhythms and light. And the evidence is that it's not great for us. And the evidence is that circadian rhythms are tied to a lot of pretty bad health outcomes, including risk for a lot of bad things, including cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And so we'll get into a little bit of that as well. So that also is kind of the background for what our mission is and kind of why we're working on this in the first place. So our mission is to develop tools to gather light exposure data to help people experience light exposure patterns that improve health outcomes. And we're really talking about being able to measure light exposure signals that are really intensity, timing, and spectrum of light to be able to correlate that to health outcomes, which are measurable things such as sleep metrics or physical health or mental health or even health events like falls. And our interest in this area really has we're trying to look at if there are things that are true for more or less all people, such as bright days and dark nights. Are those good for kind of universally? Or are there patterns that are kind of unique to particular individuals or populations based on genes or specific health conditions that have unique outcomes that have light exposure patterns that are unique to those groups. And also we're looking at ways in which advances in the measurable outcome side of things, so kind of new wearables that are giving us better data on sleep quality and other physical health measurements from wearables, as well as better AI methods for correlations between inputs and outputs that could let us know for specific health or specific light exposure patterns. Can we correlate how those patterns correspond to health outcomes? Can we learn better ways to figure out which ways that those light exposure patterns can lead to better health outcomes? So really, but we're honing in on that light exposure pattern side of it and kind of seeing that is really the core data that can unlock a lot of these areas that we think could lead to some interesting discoveries. So with that, the outline of the presentation that I'm going to give today is this. There's three areas I'm going to focus on. One is I'm going to spend a little bit of time on kind of a background on light exposure and health generally. Then I'm going to go into light therapy and specifically into aging and Alzheimer's disease, the impact there. And then the last part of the presentation, I'll talk about our work specifically, including the development of our SPEC light exposure sensor and our NIH-funded SBIR and A2 pilot project work. So I'm going to start with some light exposure and health background. So really, there's a lot of work as kind of this whole field has happened in this last quarter century. The last 25 years has kind of been sparked by the discovery of these things called the IPRGCs, or the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglia cells, which is a new photoreceptor inside the retina that that was discovered in around 2000, 2002, that was not known to be in mammals at all, or humans specifically. It was discovered, I think, in mice first in around 2000, and then in humans a couple years later, and then later discovered that has a unique sensitivity, spectral sensitivity, and tied specifically to the circadian clock, and separate from the visual system. I'll get into that a little bit. And that led to all sorts of kind of changes in the lighting industry, which is where I came up through. I've been a lighting researcher for about 30 years now, and it's really kind of revolutionized the lighting industry in ways that are honestly kind of reminiscent of the changes that the LED discovery and change of the market has made as well. So it's starting to percolate through and in changing the way that we're starting to think about designing buildings and bringing daylight into the space, and lots of different things that are happening there. The Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded in 2017 related to the circadian clock, and so it's having an effect there. I'm going to go through this complicated chart a little bit, so to kind of get into the biology here a little. So the main thing I kind of want to point out is that there are kind of on the left here, we started kind of a physical stimulus, and what we're essentially saying is that you can get light that is hitting your eye that's either coming from a natural light source like the sun or electric light source. It will eventually go through these mediating factors. I'm going to come back to those in a second. Hitting your eye, the retina, it's going to hit these IPRGCs or your rods and cones, and kind of there it goes to these two different pathways. Either it's going to go through the visual pathway that you kind of learned about in school, through your visual cortex, and give you your visual process, or it's going to go through the retinal hypothalamic pathway to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is your circadian clock in your brain. And that separate, your SNC is your central timekeeper that is reset primarily by by light hitting your IPRGCs. As Dr. Spencer said, there are a couple other things, like when you eat your meals and when you exercise has an impact on your setting the SNC, but light is the primary mechanism, and light hitting that impacts the timing of many other biological processes, including when hormones are secreted and all that jazz. This stuff right here, the mediating factors, are really kind of what we talk about what we mean when we're talking about light exposure. So the timing, the intensity, the wavelength or spectrum, the duration, and the light history is light exposure. And light history is even we're talking about, if you got how much light you got yesterday, has some impact on how sensitive you are the next day. So I'm going to go through these in a little more detail as well now. So the first thing to kind of note about intensity is that in kind of everyday usage, we experience just a massive range of intensity of light, from kind of moonlight to direct sunlight. You kind of see this chart here is in a log scale of lux, which is a measure of intensity, from about 1 lux in a full moon up to about 100,000 lux in daylight. And you'll also notice that in buildings and kind of residential office lighting, you're around 100 or a couple hundred lux, and even on an overcast or out day you're over 1,000 lux, and outside in the shade you're at 10,000 lux. So getting outside it gives you a lot of light. Next, timing is really important to our light exposure, and I'm showing here now kind of a time of day, and I have two different plots here. One, the blue line is what I've kind of made up something called a paleo lighting diet. So it's kind of what I've made up as what a caveman might see pre-electricity era, where they're seeing a dark night and a bright day, presumably, whereas a modern person is seeing some light at night and not quite as much light during the day, and getting a little too much light probably during the evening, and that's a little circadian disrupting based on what our ancestors had seen. So one takeaway, if you remember one thing from this talk, is that bright days and dark nights are good for most people. And that's one of the things we're trying to do with our device. It's one of the things it tries to remind people, but you could also remember on your own. Another element here is spectrum. That's super important. And one thing why it is important is that the peak of our circadian system, the IPRGCs, what they are sensitive to, it peaks a little more in the blue at around 480 nanometers, whereas our visual system peaks a little more in the green, around 550. So one of the consequences of that is that if you have something like a LED that has a peak in the blue, that's in alignment with that circadian peak, you can end up with a system that is a light source that is circadian activating, and provides some visual light as well. Whereas you can also have an LED system that might have a trough in the blue range and give a good amount of light for your visual system, but be really minimally circadian activating. And kind of over here in the table, I'm showing some of the metrics. Some of these new metrics here are the visual system lux metrics have been around for over 100 years, but the circadian system are some of these new metrics that have been developed over the last 10 years or so. The MEDI, melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance, is what that is. And so this is showing how activating that is of your circadian system. So in this example here, this blue enhanced LED might be a good thing to have next to your where you drink your morning coffee, or a light that you use in the winter in a far northern latitude environment, place, if you live there. Whereas the blue depleted LED could be a good thing to have in your house to use in the evening when you want to be able to see your way around or read and not activate your circadian system. And there are LED kind of color tunable LEDs that are designed explicitly for this now, that actually can kind of have a morning and evening mode and are adjustable this way. Okay, getting into light therapy, aging, and Alzheimer's now. First, I want to just define a little more carefully what I mean by light therapy. And kind of in the broadest sense, really all that means is controlling light in a way that treats a health or wellness or medical condition. And most of what I mean when I'm saying light therapy is I'm talking about specifically a circadian response. And generally what that means is bright days and dark nights. There are a number of other light therapy therapies, including UV for eczema and jaundice for newborns. And there's a lot of actually kind of new and interesting work related to red light and infrared light therapy for pain relief and healing and recovery. There's a lot of new and interesting research about how red light and infrared light can penetrate a little deeper into tissues. And there's a lot of things that we're kind of discovering now, that like, hey, these spectra of the sun that we never knew that that they had health benefits for us, and we never baked them into those LEDs that we made. And now, lo and behold, they're doing something for us physiologically that we're just discovering now. So these are also some benefits of actually measuring light exposure and seeing kind of what people experience, and so we can try to understand in what ways these matter. So before talking about Alzheimer's, I want to talk about just kind of normal aging and the way that our eye changes as we age and how that affects our light exposure. So kind of the most obvious way is that because light hitting the retina is what matters to our circadian system, as we age, our eyes, our lens clouds, and our pupils also get kind of have a harder time shrinking, and or just adjusting, I should say. And also our the lens yellows, so that changes the color of the light that we see. So these result in us needing even brighter days to get kind of an equivalent level of signal to our retina. So, and then as you kind of enter an Alzheimer's area, the things get even worse, as you might expect, that where the disease progression has often leads to poor sleep, largely, or one of the ways anyway that is caused is because the disease damages the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the circadian clock in the brain, which can lead to fragmented sleep, where where people with Alzheimer's are frequently waking up and falling asleep for shorter periods of time, and being awake for long periods or for periods during the night, and sleeping during periods of the day. And this often can lead to people having to move from home care to institutional care because it can be just too much of a burden for their home caregivers to be up in the middle of the night taking care of them. So sleep fragmentation with people with Alzheimer's is a big issue, and yeah, it can kind of lead to this pattern, this downward spiral of poor sleep leading to worse disease, leading to worse sleep. Another kind of interesting thing about light exposure and light therapy in Alzheimer's is it's probably one of the most studied light exposure areas. And the results are really, really promising. And I've just put up a couple of quotes from a number of different studies. Several of these are meta studies, so they're looking at other a larger set of studies. So I'm not going to read all of these, but just a couple samples here. So our systematic review of a meta-analysis suggests that phototherapy is a promising intervention as it can improve cognitive function in older patients with dementia, improving sleep, depression, cognition. There's some reductions in falls. I think that study actually was for older adults in general, not necessarily Alzheimer's populations. So a lot of really promising work. And in some ways, it's part of the reason I think that there's such good data here is that it's a relatively easy population to study, in that a lot of these studies have been done in care facilities where with a pretty sedentary population, or at least a population that stays in the facility, and experiments that are often kind of a before and after, where they had a traditional lighting system ahead, as a baseline, and then a circadian lighting system as a post case. And they'll do a A/B experiment kind of before and after, or some kind of control. So you have a fairly clean experimental design to be able to get a fairly clean comparison. Another reason why we're interested in focusing on Alzheimer's is just the need as well. There's 7 million people with Alzheimer's, 13 million expected with Alzheimer's by 2050, with the cost of care expected to go from around $370 billion per year today to about $1 trillion per year in 2050. And there's not a lot of good treatments. So kind of transition now to what are we doing about it. So this is, all of that is the background and context for what we put into our initial SBIR application back in 2018. We put in our first phase 1, and then we got a phase 2 after that. We have been working with Light and Health Research Center at the Mount Sinai through this whole project. And so we developed a light exposure sensor that this is it here, and also in the picture, that is both could be used as a building sensor that we originally designed it with care facilities in mind, that could be kind of placed in areas around the building to try to estimate what residents would experience in that facility, to try to account for their circadian light exposure throughout their days. And it could also be used as a wearable to monitor the light exposure of an individual kind of 24/7, and measures intensity spectrum every minute, can last for a month. And we ended up commercializing this in 2023, and have been selling these primarily to researchers who are doing clinical trials, trying to correlate specific health outcomes to specific populations, and looking at different lighting interventions. Then we actually, in 2022, got a phase 2B SBIR to more or less take what was a tool that we've been selling to researchers to do clinical trials, and repackage it and reinvent it really as a tool for people with Alzheimer's or their caregivers, to try to help them improve their own sleep and circadian entrainment. And so that's what we're in the final phases of working on now. We're in the last couple months of this project now, and about to bring this product to the market. So now we have a smaller rechargeable unit that it has about a 7-day battery now, wirelessly rechargeable. It has an app that also has a little light coach on it that we're trying to just encourage users to get a bright amount of light, hit a lighting goal in the first 2 hours of the day, and then have a kind of a void light goal in the evening, 2 hours before bedtime. And that's what we're focusing on there now. And we're in the final phases of a clinical trial there that it appears to be showing that, so we have a 50-person clinical trial. Half of that population is healthy older adults, and the other half is older adults with mild cognitive impairment. And it appears to be that the mild cognitive impairment population is at least as compliant as the general population, which is pretty compliant, I'll say, and is also at least as compliant in following the recommendations of the app, which is also pretty compliant. So they're more or less wearing it, and more or less telling us to, or getting light when we're encouraging them to. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes now talking about our Mass AITC-A2 pilot project. And what we did here is this kind of ran in parallel, and also had a clinical trial with our phase 2B project. And what we really wanted to do here is dive into the sleep part of it a little deeper, and add some sleep tracking elements to this. And one of the kind of main research questions that we had here was wanting to know if we could detect the signal of the light exposure that it had on sleep with a commercially available light exposure sensor, our spec, and a commercial sleep tracker, the Apple Watch, in the noisy real world. So kind of that stuff that Dr. Spencer talked about early on, where the sleep trackers are out there, they're getting better, but there's they're not labs grade yet. But are they how good are they, and um, can we see that signal through the noise? And then we're also still really interested in this compliance question. So some of the main activities that we did in this project were we added an integration with an Apple Health Kit to our app, specifically for the Apple Watch. So what we did is we're not getting lighting data per se from the Apple Watch. Well, we're pulling some in just to kind of check it out, but it's not actionable for our light exposure. It's kind of the wrong type of. It's not spectral data. It's just light intensity data, and it's on the wrist, not the eye, and it's covered up part of the time. But what's really interesting to us there is the sleep data. So now we've got sleep data that we compare to the light exposure data we get from the spec. So we built that into the app now. And then we did a 2-month observational study with 28 subjects. We were originally just looking to do 1 month with 15 subjects, but we had a lot of interest and we took them all and got a lot of nice data. So I want to throw this back. This is the chart I had right at the beginning where we're talking about kind of these input signals and health outcomes. And in this study, this is kind of what we were, breaking it down a little bit further and saying like, okay, so when people get, bright days and dark nights, kind of having this goal, which wasn't a goal we gave them. We essentially said, go live your normal life and, get whatever light exposure you normally get, but are we able to see in the naturally occurring bright days and dark nights that they get, and the naturally occurring variation in their biology, behavior, caffeine, alcohol consumption, et cetera, and measurement errors related to how well or poor the Apple Watch does and how good or poor their compliance are we able to see some effects in sleep outcomes, and we did. We're still kind of pouring through the data and plan to do quite a bit more analysis. But the kind of bottom line is that for the main analysis we did is on the 16 subjects who are the most highly compliant, which we kind of filtered as those who had at least 21 days where they wore the spec for at least 12 hours and had valid sleep data for that particular night. Then we saw positive correlations between getting bright days and dark nights, and increases in improvements in sleep metrics. And kind of what I'm showing on this graph here is correlation coefficients between hours after leaving bed and let's see there, hours after leaving bed and the time of day, and if it's above I'm kind of trying to explain this with my hands, but you probably can't see where I'm pointing to on the graph. So the black line there is the average of all of the users. The colored lines are individual users. So the black line is kind of showing that on average, when you're above the 0 in the morning hours, you're getting a positive correlation with getting bright light, and having an improvement in total sleep time that evening. And then below that, you're seeing that getting bright light in those evenings, kind of or in the hours right before bedtime, you're getting a negative correlation. So that's what we're showing here. And we're going to continue to look through this. We haven't done all of the analysis for things such as sleep fragmentation is one of the things that's a little trickier to look at, but important for some of the reasons I mentioned. So wrapping up here, we're about to go to market with what we're calling the Spec M for Spec Mobile. It's a wearable to improve sleep for and circadian entrainment. We're targeting people with Alzheimer's disease in their families, their caregivers. But it's important to note that there's really nothing Alzheimer's disease specific about this product as it currently is designed. And so I think we also are, want to make a pitch to people who have chronic sleep problems, period, or people with circadian rhythm problems. And honestly, just early adopters in the general wellness market as well. And so we're planning on going to market later this year, kind of exploring all three of these areas and getting some initial feedback and being kind of humble about what we don't know about these markets, because I think that we're going to, make some changes about certainly relative to the user interface or even how we engage with these customers about what type of information is needed and kind of how we even engage with some of these end users or customers. And I think it's possible that there could end up being a more medically oriented product, perhaps for Alzheimer's related patients, and maybe a more consumer oriented product for more general wellness applications. And so commercial release and seeking partners, especially to kind of learn more about or to kind of connect us to some of those patient groups who, again, we're lighting scientists and computer scientists, and learning a lot about Alzheimer's populations since our work on this for the last 7 years. But it's leaning on the community to learn where to go forward with them as well. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the rest of my team. And I think Dave Harris on my team, our research coordinators on the call. My co-founders, Will and Neil, are both computer scientists, PhDs. Hank is our statistician. And I definitely want to thank Dr. Spencer, who's been our mentor on this project. He's been a lot of help. And David has also been there for me on a number of occasions as well. So thank you, David. And I look forward to any questions that any of you have.
All righty. Thank you very much, Erik, and a great presentation and background. And I'm sure if people, have use cases and are interested in how to partner or use it for research or be an early adopter, feel free to reach out to Erik. But with that, we'll transition to Q&A. So either please raise your hand, and you can unmute and ask your question, or feel free to type in and we'll get in the order as they're received. Thank you. Question from Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Thomas from Beth Israel. I'm a sleep physician. I also run a clinical circadian program here for the last 10 plus years. Of course, we tend to see somewhat more extreme circadian rhythms where making a diagnosis is somewhat easier, but tracking, of course, is quite difficult. And the instability domain or unstable domain or loss of regularity domain is not in the clinical mainstream, unfortunately. I've been dealing with it at least since 2005, but it's not part of the insomnia classifications and so on, although loss of regularity is certainly seeing more research interest. I've used the Actilume before Philips pulled out of the market. And certainly for average clinical purposes, just seeing that the light is, on for too long and so on, works reasonably well. Not great, but works reasonably well. So I would certainly be interested in using this kind of technology in the clinic. I see patients with non-24-hour sleep-wake cycle disorder. They go around the clock. I'm sure they're not, changing the light around the clock. Or those who have very unstable sleep-wake cycles. They eat at any time they can, they do whatever they can, whenever they can, and their life is in perpetual severe jet lag.
Yeah.
And you can't have them keep detailed logs more than 2 days, maybe, and then it's gone. So, what would be the cost of the new device, roughly?
Yeah. So our current device, we sell for $6.99 to researchers. I think our new device will not be more than that. And certainly if we start selling to consumers in any kind of volume, prices are going to go down. So,
Yeah, you will need to have a consumer price
yeah.
because I'm talking here about patients basically using it like they use a glucometer.
Yeah.
Same, bad sugar, track your sugars, bad blood pressure, track your blood pressure and such. Because these patients are pretty much lifers, the ones we see in clinic anyway. They're not going to become normal. I mean, we can try to buffer their circadian rhythms, but we can't really just stop the clock any way we want, and they would need to track. We can track their, I mean, any of the the watches and Fitbit charge and etc. is good enough to give the basic boundaries of sleep, but light is clearly the missing link. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of question time.
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, some of the things that makes me think about too is just or something I think about a lot related to that is the variability and sensitivity to light, especially at like low light levels, is really high. It's the limited data seems to suggest, right? So there's the light levels at in residential settings may be circadian activating for some people and not for others. So even just knowing that for people who have certain circadian or sleep disorders, that would be really good thing to know, to have to have some a wearable light sensor that is sensitive enough to measure at low light levels and also do a dim light melatonin onset test or something.
So I do Dilmos regularly in clinic. Well, I do onset, offset, 24-hour mapping, depending on what the question is.
Yeah.
Sometimes we add cortisol to it. Now, patients pay for this melatonin or cortisol testing. And for the melatonin, the 9 samples is $179. And Salometrics on the West Coast does those for us. The patients pay them directly, basically.
Yeah.
So that kind of cost patients are willing to. I mean, for me, $600 research cost, not a problem.
Yeah.
But a patient is not going to pay $600.
No, I 100% agree. Yeah. For researchers, yeah, no one is, we haven't had an issue with that because it's for providing a tool that is in need. But consumers, yeah, it's a whole different economy. Yeah, I think it's got to be.
I'll follow up with you on email and we'll chat a little bit. Okay, thank you.
Eric, we have a question in Q&A from Laura McIntosh, who's a grant year 4 Mass AITC pilot awardee. She's asking, for homeward bound people, do you think that a passive wall unit would provide sufficient data to derive correlations? The advantage being that it doesn't require active compliance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more sedentary, the more possible that could be. And we certainly had some, like there are some people, some researchers who have used our devices have looked at some care facility settings where they've had both wearable devices and like 3 wall-based sensors and tried to look at, hey, can these 3 wall-based sensors tell us what the one wearable has done? And I think that there are indications that it's probably true. So yeah, I think that that's that probably could be done. But I think that if you're, it really depends on the application and how much somebody's moving around. And I think that one of the things that really is important to note is kind of gets back to that intensity plot that I noted, that if you're missing kind of just even like one period of time where you go outside for 10 minutes and, have a period where you go from 100 lux to 10,000 lux and you miss that, that's an important piece of data you're missing. So that's kind of the primary consideration.
Then we have another Q&A from Dr. Jennifer Stamps, who's a another Mass AITC Grant Year 2 pilot awardee, wondering if I guess Becky Spencer's not here to answer this also, but if anyone has looked at the effects on pineal gland function or have any info on how it's involved in this process.
I'm sorry, can you read that? I didn't hear that.
Have you looked at the effects on pineal gland function?
Yeah, I mean that's the melatonin where that's so yeah that's it's a direct impact. The light is a direct directly prevents or dampens the impact of the pineal gland from secreting melatonin in the evening when it normally will. Light will inhibit it from secreting.
Erik, just a quick question. This is Deepak. Thanks for the talk, first of all, and the pilot project.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, do you have enough longitudinal data from any of the participants, either in this study or other studies, to really see, what is the correlation because of the spectrum that they're exposed to? Is it because of the amount of time that they're exposed to the different things? Like, do you see individual level variations, where you can correlate sleep, total sleep time, or some other aspect of sleep to the various dimensions of the information you're getting from?
Yeah, not from our data necessarily. I mean, I think that overall, I think that the lighting science field, I think that the view is that intensity is probably the most important parameter of the things that I mentioned. I think that there are applications where spectrum matters quite a bit, and I think that I think that is probably in the lower light environments where you're kind of on a cusp, maybe around whether you're near the activation point of your circadian lighting system or not, and wherever you're kind of in the more on the blue end of the spectrum, then you might be activating, and if you're on the red, you're not. But the intensity is like the big hammer, and spectrum is kind of like the little the more refined tool in terms of the impact of light. And then I don't know, timing is critical as well, and I think that there's still a huge amount of unknowns. I mean, I think that the importance of that early morning light, I think we used to just say like light during the day is important, and light at night, avoiding it at night is also important. And I think now they're realizing, or we are realizing a little more like, okay, that first couple of hours is matters maybe even more than we had realized, because it even can inoculate your sensitivity at night to getting to the intensity that you do see at night. So it's complicated and interactive and biologically different in different people. So it's kind of messy, and there's not a really clear answer. Yeah.
I think just you do have 2 months of data from this pilot, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is enough longitudinal data per person to tease apart maybe some of the.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was thinking is that if you were to do this again, it would be perhaps useful to get some on the watch, have some indicator of mood or something like that from the previous night and the next day morning.
Yeah.
Because there's often it's light exposure, but there's other things also involved in sleep, and maybe you can tease the different effects apart.
Yeah, that's right. And I think when I think about like the health outcomes side of things and kind of linking up the light exposure element that we're really focusing on, and then thinking about Alzheimer's in particular, there are a number of kind of like mood and cognition type of, health apps and whatnot. I'm definitely interested in, partnering with some folks on that side of things and just saying like, hey, what about, if, what you guys are doing to kind of quantify the impact or just kind of being able to, digitally keep track of progress of cognition or mood, let's also look at how light exposure impacts that over periods of time. So yeah, I would love to be able to have that be one of the things that is tracked as an output, that we can say, hey, these specific light exposure patterns, when you do X, Y, and Z with your lighting, it seems to improve your mood or cognition in these ways.
Thanks.
And then we have one more quick, I think, question in the Q&A from Sarah Palas. She's wondering if it would likely be helpful with delayed sleep phase disorder.
Yeah, I mean, I think you absolutely can with purposeful light exposure or light avoidance, shift your circadian rhythm, forward or backwards. And this is, we actually experimented with this a little bit in part of our current phase 2B, did kind of a semi-experiment around one of the daylight savings times to see if we could get some of our cohort to get ready for daylight savings. And we kind of, as a control, we kind of played a mean trick on the other half and got them 2 hours out of sync before the time change. So yeah, it can be done.
All righty, thanks. Any other questions from the audience? I guess I have one quick one related to sort of the compliance, Eric, in terms of for the AD population. I guess what do you see in terms of, increase the battery life to 7? And there's obviously, integrations with Apple Watch. What do you see sort of barriers that need to be solved in terms of either, further improvements to battery life, if that's still a thing you're looking at, or, sort of facilitating for older adults with more severe AD, sort of caregiver dyadic
Yeah.
connections that, or, sort of don't overburden caregivers. So I guess what are you guys looking at next
Yeah.
phase?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Yeah. I mean, compliance is so for earlier stage Alzheimer's, so for like mild stage or for mild cognitive impairment and early stage Alzheimer's, it seems like it's not a big issue. I think that at least that's what the current trial seems to suggest, is that with mild cognitive impairment anyway, it's similar to general population, which is surprisingly compliant, at least clinical trial participants, which I'm not going to necessarily assume is going to be the same thing as a customer. A clinical trial participant is maybe more compliant than an average person. But yeah, I think as the disease progresses, I think that considerations change. And so that's part of why we, started with the bigger device in the first place, because it had a, 6-month battery in there that could be worn for a complete duration of a clinical trial, which is still how some of them are used. But I think in a care facility where you have I think we're picturing a devices that are more owned by the nursing staff, right? Where you might have, if you have somebody who has a sleep disorder, that is, you might have devices that are, that you have a light prescription that you give to a person that the nurse then says, put something on somebody that tries to keep it on them for a few days to have them try to meet that prescription and go from there. But yeah, it's going to be something that we'll have to kind of see how that plays out. Because yeah, there will be some challenges there.
Alrighty, thank you, Eric, for your time, and thank you everyone who stayed on for an extra minute. Look forward to you joining us for our next session in June. Thanks, everyone.